Good evening, everyone. If I could have your attention. On behalf of the board and staff of Morven Museum and Garden, I want to thank you so much for attending our 2025 Grand Homes and Gardens. This is a sold-out series, so thank you very much. Mid-century modern must have really hit all of your interests. This is the third program. We have one left to do of our Grand Homes and Garden series, The Quality of Doing, Mid-Century Modern Grand Homes and Gardens. So far in the series, we've moved along the East Coast, visiting iconic mid-century homes, the Corman House and the Glass House. Tonight, we're headed to the Midwest to explore the Edith Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois. It is fitting that we are celebrating Women's History Month because although tonight's speaker will discuss the architect of the Farnsworth House, the renowned Ludwig Mies van der Rohe her research richly examines the influence and direction of the home's namesake, Dr. Edith Farnsworth. First, I'd like to thank our sponsors for tonight's series and give them a chance to say a few words. At this time, I'd like to invite Brian Taylor up from the Bryn Mawr Trust to share some words. And I have a microphone, or you can just, if you project, you want to try the mic?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you all. Welcome. Good evening. As Rhonda mentioned, my name is Brian Taylor. I'm the Wealth Director for the Princeton office of Bryn Mawr Trust. And on behalf of Bryn Mawr Trust, it is our genuine pleasure to sponsor the 2025 Morven Grand Homes and Gardens series here. In this, fortunately, on a very nice night compared to the rainy night that we had last week on Wednesday. So much different weather tonight. So again, tonight we're celebrating the timeless beauty and innovation of mid-century modern homes. By supporting Morven, Bryn Mawr Trust aligns itself as an institution that values legacy, preservation, and the beauty of well-planned estates, both financially and architecturally. It's the perfect partnership rooted in heritage, vision, and long-term impact. At Bryn Mawr Trust, we've been a part of the communities we serve for over 135 years, and it's events like this tonight that remind us why we love our communities so much. It's about the connection to each other, to the stories that shape us, and to the spaces that bring us joy. I'd like to wish a heartfelt thank you to Rhonda, Megan, Greer, and the entire Morven staff for letting us be a part of their commitment to celebrating architectural excellence, including the sleek lines and visionary design of mid-century modern homes. Whether an architect, a preservationist, a design enthusiast, or simply someone who appreciates beautiful spaces, I hope tonight's journey to the Edith Farnsworth House deepens your appreciation for this remarkable era of design. Once again, thank you for allowing Bryn Mawr Trust to be a part of this special event. Please enjoy tonight's program and the remainder of the Grand Homes and Garden series. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brian. And now I'd like to welcome Debbie Schaefer from Mrs. G's Appliances, the sponsor for tonight's program.
Hello, everybody. So again, my name is Debbie Schaefer. I'm the third generation owner of Mrs. G. And for those that don't know, Mrs. G is an award-winning local independent appliance store making life better for 90 years. Oh my goodness, we're celebrating 90 years this year. And it's Women's History Month, as Rhonda said, and it's 3 generations owned by women, the store. Yeah. So here's a fun fact. The average lifespan of a family-owned business is 24 years. In the second generation, only 40% is family make it to the second generation, and 13% make it to the third generation, and 3% make it to the fourth generation. So I have twin girls who are 31. They know the door's always open for them. They're not ready yet. They're not ready yet. So for those a lot of people want to know, like, how does Mrs. G do it? How are we able to support, all these wonderful community and nonprofit around our area here? And it's really because of what my grandmother had started many, many years ago. And, we were able to, we take care of the customer, most important. We take care of them before, during, but especially after the sale. And we have a great selection of brands, and we also have extremely knowledgeable sales professionals who really do take care of the customer. But also, my grandmother and myself, we feel that it's so important. It's a long-standing tradition with Mrs. G's to support our community and also to support all the nonprofits that we can do. So I'm proud, to be able to be here tonight. Morven is a gem in our community. I live not too far from here, so I'm happy to do this tonight. I've been doing it for 3 years, right? So I started with the Palm Beach House. It was the one that I sponsored 3 years ago, the Flagler, I think it was the Flagler, and then Drum Thracket last year, and this year the Farnsworth. So I'm really happy to be here tonight because I love design and I love history. So it's just, it's special to me, but I also love modern. So this is a real treat, real treat. So I invite you all to connect with me on LinkedIn and to follow Mrs. G's on Facebook and Instagram, and then also on TikTok, for those of you on TikTok. But thank you, Rhonda, for allowing Mrs. G's to sponsor tonight. I'm really looking forward to Nora doing her presentation. I was here last week for the Philip Johnson House, the Glass House, and it was just amazing. And I'm sure this is going to be another great, exciting lecture. And just grateful to spend the evening with everybody tonight, and enjoy.
That's okay. I don't remember everything. Before I introduce the speaker, I just want to go through some housekeeping notes. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the talk, and my colleague Greer over there, who is our education curator of education and public programs, will be there roving around with the microphone. And then for those who are joining us virtually, please drop your questions in the Q&A box and I'll read them aloud for the speaker. A recording of the program will also be shared with all of the registrants here tonight a few days following the event. I would be remiss if I didn't, since we're talking about Grand Homes and Gardens, remind everybody that our spring plant sale is now online, and it closes on April 7th, and it's been doing phenomenally well. So get your plants now. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, who is joining us from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Nora Wendl. She is an essayist, artist, editor, and associate professor of architecture at the University of New Mexico, where she teaches studio and theory. Wendy's work across scales and media subverts the received narratives that underpin architectural historiography. She engages feminist archival practices to create essays, books, installations, photographs, and films that offer new forms and frameworks for historicizing the built and unbuilt environments. These works have been supported by the Graham Foundation, Santa Fe Art Institute, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation, among other institutions. She has exhibited and published widely, and her most recent book, Almost Nothing: Reclaiming Edith Farnsworth, was shortlisted for the 2022 Gray Wolf Press Nonfiction Prize. From 2021 to 2024, she was the executive editor of the Journal of Architectural Education. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're so happy you could be here. And I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And it was just amazing listening to everybody speak about their role in this community. I feel really fortunate to be giving this talk tonight. I hope I keep you entertained, but I mostly just want to say I really wish I was there in person. I can tell this is a really energized, active community of folks who love design and history, and I love those things too. So I'm really excited to be able to share my work with you and hopefully share with you things that maybe you did not know about the Edith Farnsworth House. So I'm going to be talking about my efforts to rewrite the history of the Dr. Edith Farnsworth House, what that process has entailed, and what happens when you dig into the history of modern architecture. So I'd like to begin this talk with something unusual and ahistorical that has informed really the entire history of this house, which is a rumor. You can read the headline here. This was from the New York Times Style magazine. And the headline reads, "Sex and Real Estate, Farnsworth House, Mies van der Rohe's masterpiece is up for grabs, along with a juicy tale." The article was published in 2003, just 6 months before the house was to be auctioned by Sotheby's. Lord Peter Palumbo, who you see on the slide at the top left, the British real estate baron, had purchased the grounds and the house directly from Edith Farnsworth in 1972, but after restoring the house and grounds, he found himself in a health crisis and needed to sell it. So he turned to the media to advertise the upcoming auction. And in many ways, an auction makes sense. The Edith Farnsworth House, if you visited, you know, it could definitely be viewed as a one-of-a-kind collector's item. Completed in March 1951 in Plano, Illinois, which is roughly 60 miles west of Chicago. It was the first house that Mies van der Rohe succeeded in building in the United States. And it has all the details that we expect of the American stage of his career. So it's a house with an open one-room plan. As you can see here, you notice that the bathrooms are contained within the core of the house, some storage, some kitchen cupboards, but otherwise the house is an entirely open one-room plan. It has luxurious materials like travertine marble for the flooring inside and out, and of course the structural system applied to the exterior, which is something that we know Mies van der Rohe developed during his American career. In this case, these are white painted steel I-beams from which the house hangs structurally, and the glass walls that wrap around the entire perimeter of the house. And you know, if you've been there, that when you stand inside the Farnsworth House, these walls render the world beyond them into a painting. So it's no wonder that in 1951, Architectural Forum announced that it was the most important house completed in the US in over a decade. This article describes the Farnsworth House as the setting for one of the, quote, juiciest tales in real estate, a story of how great architecture can be hijacked by love. And in the article, the author rehashes the familiar rumor that Dr. Edith Farnsworth, a Chicago area physician, professor, researcher, poet, and translator, she had many facets to her identity, had a romance with the architect Mies van der Rohe throughout the house's design and construction, which went awry and led to their falling out and lawsuits, which I'll talk about in a minute, against one another as soon as the construction was complete. So this narrative of the love affair is very familiar, very common, but it's something that the author of this article did not actually invent. The rumor of the architect-client romance was first written by historian Franz Scholz in 1985 in a biography of Mies van der Rohe, and you can read the excerpt here. It became adapted over and over through generations of writers and historians, even becoming part of the official narrative of the tour of the house. So if you were to have visited the Farnsworth House prior to 2020, it was probably a key part of the tour narrative. So I became curious not just about whether Dr. Farnsworth and Mies did actually have a relationship. I mean, I was a bit curious to find out if that was true, but I was also curious about why, whether or not it was true, architectural history might rely so heavily on this, and what that reveals about all of us, both as producers and consumers of history. What I discovered is that it's a rumor not built on very solid ground. So historians have relied on an offhand comment made by Mies during their trial that, quote, the lady expected the architect to go along with the house. Now, arguably, Mies would be looking for any statement to discredit Farnsworth and win his case. So I find it hard to see this as proof. And he had a lot at stake in the trial. Not only was he suing Farnsworth for fees that they had no contract enforcing, but he had actually put a lien on the Farnsworth House so that if she did not pay what he was stipulating, he would then be allowed to keep it. Understandably, Edith Farnsworth was outraged when she found out she was being sued. She'd paid $74,000 for the structure by 1951. To put that into today's equivalent, that would be over $900,000. So almost $1 million toward this house. And then she gets sued. So Scholes and other historians have leaned into the narrative that Farnsworth initiated the lawsuit against Mies herself out of vengeance when he allegedly dumped her. But what the transcripts of the trial actually reveal is that, in fact, it was Mies who first sued Edith for $30,000, a combination of unpaid architect's fees for designing the house. And again, they had no contract about fees, and contracting himself to send out bids to others to build it, plus $4,000 in electrician's fees that she had not paid. So it's important to note that they had no contract estimating what the house would cost or how fees would be calculated. And in reality, Edith then countersued Mies, claiming that he misrepresented the cost of the house and his ability to design and deliver it at the original price, which was at the start of the project $40,000, then crept to $60,000, and then finally, ultimately, came to $74,000 just for the cost of building it. In the end, this was informed by many things, including the Korean War, but this did not include any of the fees that he had calculated. So my ability to overturn the narrative of this love affair was dependent upon being able to access and read this trial transcript, which I've been describing and showing to you in slides. And I discovered that it would be very difficult to access the transcript during the process of research. A flood at the original courthouse had destroyed the copy held by Kendall County. The only existent copy of the trial transcript then was held in the living room of a Mies scholar who allowed me to come and read it in his living room, but made me promise not to copy it or distribute it to the internet. Eventually, I was able to get a digital copy that I could actually read closely. But even at that point, I was warned that I needed to guard everything appropriately and all will be well, which I found to be a rather vague and threatening statement to tell somebody who is simply a scholar trying to do research on a history. So it was at that moment when researching this history that I realized to write the history of the Farnsworth House, I would have to also write my own life as well, what it was like to encounter obstacles to reclaiming or retelling this history of a modern house. So what you're looking at right now are stills from a film I made in residency at the Santa Fe Art Institute with filmmaker Melinda Frame. And in the film, I enact the silencing of blacking out every line of the transcript, performatively burying the information that I read in response to the threat, or I guess vaguely veiled threat, from the person who let me look at the transcript to guard everything appropriately. So this became a part of telling the history of the house, was actually telling the difficulties of accessing some of this documentation and the difficulty in negotiating how I would share details about this, because Mies's identity is so caught up in a sort of mythic narrative that many people are quite guarded about letting you look at materials that might show him in a not so flattering or unflattering light. So Edith would ultimately win this court battle, largely due to what I mentioned before, the lack of contract, and she would keep the house. But I believe historians have retaliated by making her lose in what I would call the court of public opinion. So she's been created for years into a unlikable, if not embarrassing figure. And this goes on for a long time. Even the early reviews of the house, when the lawsuit is just beginning, she's imagined as being gone already or a ghost. And you can read it here in the first review of the house ever published in October of 1951 in the Architectural Forum. Here, Edith is described as a temporary tenant, and I called my book Almost Nothing as both a play on what Mies van der Rohe told Edith Farnsworth, that our house would be almost nothing, a very simple project, nothing to worry about, and with the awareness that she has been treated as almost nothing, certainly nobody of consequence within architectural history, although, as I hope to show tonight, she was a very, very influential person. So how does one write an architectural history when the subject has been so maligned and, I would say, inappropriately interpreted for so long? I had a few bright spots. Of course, if you're writing a history, you're going to look at other histories. And the historian Alice T. Friedman had actually convinced Dr. Farnsworth's family to donate her papers to the Newberry Library. And she had written herself an account of Farnsworth's experience working with Mies van der Rohe in her wonderful book, Women in the Making of the Modern House. But outside of Dr. Friedman's book, I could not rely on many previous histories to do my research. As you've seen, they were quite biased. So instead, I decided I would need to write what I call an interior history of this architecture, not a history of the building that treats the client as a condition outside of it, but an interior history that treats the history of architecture as the history of desire, and that places the client's desires for a different way of living at the center. I was really interested in understanding not as much about the house, but about Dr. Farnsworth's desire to actually build it. So to access this interior history, I began with her papers, which are held at the Newberry Library, and they're a generous gift from her family, as I mentioned before. Dr. Friedman convinced her family to give these papers to the Newberry, which is a public library, so it was a great place to do this research. The primary components of this include her unpublished memoirs, photographs, correspondence, poetry, and poetry translations, so a really robust, very interdisciplinary archive. I ran into some issues, which is that her unpublished memoirs are not written in strict chronological order. And in fact, they begin with the Great Chicago Fire, which happened a generation before she was born. She also includes both real events and fictionalizations. So stories that she wrote blur into her recollections of real events, which was often difficult to parse. And there are large gaps. So there are 18 missing pages from the memoirs themselves. So it raised the question, how does one begin to create a character or a clear sense of desire from all of this, some of which is fictive, some of which is real, none of which is in chronological order. So because it took a lot of time, I had a sabbatical and I moved to Chicago to do this research, and I would spend hours in her archive reading and rewriting and typing her memories until they almost seemed to become my own. There are some biographical facts that we can start with to sort of orient ourselves. So Edith Brooke Farnsworth was born in Chicago on November 17th, 1903, and she was raised on Chicago's near North Side and in Winnetka. Her family owned two lumber companies, the Oconto Lumber Company of Wisconsin and the Bay de Noquet Lumber Company of Michigan. And I include these photographs side by side of Marion and Edith Farnsworth, the sisters, in a garden and a lumber camp at the Bay de Noquet Lumber Company, to acknowledge that the wealth and comfort that Dr. Farnsworth experienced really would have been impossible without the labor of the lumber camps that her family owned. And so these material realities are very tied together. She graduated from Massachusetts boarding school in 1920, returned to Chicago and spent 2 years attending the American Conservatory of Music. And then she enrolled at the University of Chicago to study English and zoology. So she did not finish these degrees. She began studying. And then by 1924, she sailed to Italy, where she spent 2 years training in violin with Mario Corti. And we know from ship logs, not so much from the memoirs, which again are not chronological and do not detail everything, but we know from ship logs that she spent the next several years traveling back and forth between Europe and the US. And this is a period of time that she describes in her memoirs as her years of vague expansion. And I absolutely love this phrase. There are years that blur together in her memoirs with no strict chronology to differentiate when she's in the United States and when she's traveling abroad. But these years of vague expansion are a really robust time in her life when she developed what I think of as sort of the worldview that she had that led to making this house. So while traveling, she writes that she is, quote, released from dimensions that I was used to thinking of as mine. So wide, so long, so thick, with certain traits thrown in, but always through the refractions of other people's eyes. She writes, but now there is nothing to limit one's transcending. And in this statement, I found an acknowledgement that I had been seeking. In approaching her archive, instead of worrying about strict chronology, which was missing anyway, I could just focus on these transformative moments in her memoirs as a sort of way of hanging on to this question of interior history or desire that led to this house. So not all transformative moments were easy to trace down. For instance, this is a photograph of Edith Farnsworth in Castine, Maine in 1926, not held in her papers, but owned by the Castine Historical Society in Castine, Maine. She had just arrived back from Italy and her 2 years of violin studies with Mario Corti, and she describes herself as a graft on her own root as she returns to where she spends summers with her families, a reference to feeling out of place, obviously, though the specifics of why she felt this way are not given. The photograph, as you can see at the bottom, lists the names of everybody in it. So MGP, known as Polly Porter, is on the left, and Edith Farnsworth is in the center. She is the one kind of lounging. I've circled her so you can identify her. These 6 women are picnicking and smoking. Edith lounges on a rock at the center, and behind the camera, taking the photograph, is Polly Porter's partner, Molly Dewson, the American feminist and political activist. So Polly and Molly were not the only queer couple in Castine by far. There were many others, some of whom opened businesses together there. And these women had enough wealth that they did not need to marry men, could live in what were colloquially termed Boston marriages, and enjoy the freedom that at the same time 2 men would never have had in that era. And Castine is an interesting place because at that time and since the Civil War, all of its maritime business, including working shipyards, shipbuilding, and trade to the south, had been crushed, and Maine was still rebuilding its economy. So the town was very welcoming to wealthy New Yorkers and Philadelphians who built summer cottages here after the Civil War. It was a really welcoming place, and it was a place that Molly and Polly could have lived openly, which is why we see, why we have this wonderful photograph. So I want to read a little bit from my book. I have a galley copy, and I want just to read a piece of the book that will contextualize what we're seeing in the photograph a bit better than I can do in the lecture. Edith's memoirs are written at the end of her life, decades after this photograph was taken, and they are written for an audience, though that imagined audience remains unknown. Her education took place under circumstances in which she was one of the quota of 4 women admitted into her graduating class at Northwestern University Medical School when working women were seen to erode the American family. In the 1930s, the New York Times reported in front-page news that women, quote, suffering from masculine psychological states, in other words, loving other women, could be cured by having one of their adrenal glands removed, a correction that would fix their, quote, aversion to marriage. The majority of Dr. Farnsworth's career as a doctor, medical researcher, and professor took place during the Lavender Scare, from the late 1940s into the 1960s, during which time anyone even socializing with someone suspected of being gay made them guilty by association. The government, under the sway of Senator Joseph McCarthy's hysteria, regularly and procedurally harassed and fired people suspected of being gay, justified by the U.S. Senate, who claimed that they exhibited a weakness of their moral fiber. Perhaps the muscle memory of silencing was still present as she wrote her memoirs. Perhaps the friction between self and performance of self for survival eroded her ability to give language to this world or the desire to do so. And yet, in this photograph of women in Castine, nothing is censored. There is joy, no self-consciousness, just camaraderie. It is the only photograph I have ever seen of Edith in which she looks fully relaxed, unspooled, almost unrecognizably secure in herself among these women. So Farnsworth returns to Europe for a few years after this photograph is taken, but leaves as it becomes clear that fascism is on the rise. So as I mentioned, she becomes a doctor. She is admitted to the Northwestern University Medical School class of 1938. They allow 4 women per year to join the medical school, and she graduates at the age of 35. I like to share how she was described in the Chicago Tribune in 1942, years after she graduated from medical school. So by this time, she's in her late 30s or early 40s, and she's well into her practice. She's described as a tall, handsome girl, almost 40, with a splendid physique and much enthusiasm. So the article, while not so professional sounding and really kind of infantilizing her, even though she's a grown woman who's practicing medicine, the article does note that many of her associates are now in military service, since this is during World War II, and that she has found herself with additional responsibility. And she had, with all of the men out of the way, she could start her practice treating patients, and she could also do some remarkable research in her laboratory. So Farnsworth was an innovator, and during her time as a physician and researcher, she studied nephritis, which was then a fatal inflammatory kidney disease, described as the 4th major killer among human diseases in this article that I've included in the slide. So she made a really interesting, she worked with an interesting discovery, which is that the pituitary glands of hogs could actually be utilized for their hormones, which could be given to human patients to stimulate their own adrenal glands if they were suffering from nephritis. And I love this unusual collaboration between a meatpacking plant and a doctor, and this photograph of a man holding a day's worth of extracted hog pituitary glands that are on their way to treat patients who have nephritis. So she had these really kind of remarkable discoveries in her career that made a huge difference in the medical field. And so by the mid-1940s, she's well into her practice, as I said. She's innovating things, and she's also looking for something that she can build for herself. So she's driving around the west of Chicago, and she sees the acreage that she'd like to purchase. It had been a Tribune experimental farm, a working laboratory owned by McCormick, who at that time was also the owner of the Chicago Tribune, to test new agricultural techniques, crops, and animal husbandry practices. So she's interested in this, what was a Tribune farm or former Tribune farm along the Fox River. She purchases the land, and she decides that she wants to build something meaningful on it. She knows that to do this, she needs to hire an architect. And this is, after all, in many ways, her story of transformations. So she hires Mies van der Rohe, who she's connected to by friends. She's unmarried, so she can build a one-room house for herself. And she saw this project as a model for a new American style of housing. And she saw herself as an important patron, allowing the architect a chance to innovate. So on the left, you see an article. She actually wrote an essay for Mies van der Rohe on the occasion of the 1947 retrospective of his career at the Museum of Modern Art. And she has this, I think, clear understanding that Mies van der Rohe's architecture is about something more than simply sheltering. She realizes that there's a real art form behind it. She's curious about it. She's interested in it to the extent that she's writing this essay for him. And she also, at the 1947 retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, she sees the model of her house exhibited for the first time. And she, as she writes, boards the train back to Chicago, reflecting that our project might become the prototype of new and important elements in American architecture. So I think she really saw the work that she was doing and what she was producing with Mies as something very important. And just like her medical research, something that could actually make a significant difference in culture. But the project, as we noticed earlier, detours in price and materiality once they begin, and she begins to find herself being decentered from the project. So what was about a different way of living suddenly became about an architectural masterpiece, and this became really the focus of the project rather than the life that she would be able to live there. So she drives countless architects to the site as this is being designed and built. People who are curious about the project call Mies, and she drives folks out to this site to look at the building that's emerging from the ground. She would go with the office of Mies van der Rohe on outings to see it during construction. So one can imagine that from 1946 to 1951, while the house was being designed and built, this must have been an all-consuming project, even for Edith Farnsworth. And there was a lot of interest from the world. So people who had heard about the house wrote to ask to photograph it. And Mies's office, as you can see in this exchange of correspondence, Mies's office would often shoo them away and say, you can't take photographs of the house, largely, as you can read in the letter, because the house was not furnished in the way that Mies van der Rohe wanted it to be furnished. Edith had rejected his offers to put Barcelona chairs and other Mies van der Rohe designed furniture in the house. She wanted to put in her own. So this, of course, impacted the way the house would look in photographs, and it became something the office really wanted to control, and Mies really wanted to control. Photographs taken by Bill Hedrick, hired by Mies van der Rohe, show the informal way in which Dr. Farnsworth lived in the house. And these were cropped for publication, as you can see along that yellow line. Farnsworth had selected her own furniture for the house, and she even had a bed on the floor that she would sleep in. To her, it was in many ways an informal place to go relax. But the photographs, as you can see, were cropped before they were allowed to be published. So this is around the time that the trial begins, and there's a battle in the media over what the Farnsworth house would look like. Would it look like a place for quiet contemplation and relaxing, or a modern architectural project, an extension really of its architect? So if you can imagine, Mies was used to getting a complete project, furniture and all. And so this was quite a battle for him, I think, to realize that now he had a client who was going to insist on her own furniture and her own way of living in the house. And during the lawsuit from 1951 to 55, Edith Farnsworth herself takes to the media, and she finds problematic ways to sway the court of public opinion. So she held interviews with Elizabeth Gordon and Joseph Barry, who published pieces in House Beautiful decrying the Farnsworth House as a threat to democracy, taking advantage of McCarthyism and the Red Scare to discredit Mies van der Rohe. And it's been said that this is what finally made Mies want the trial to simply be over and made him, unfortunately, never want to build another house in the United States. However, once the lawsuit was settled in 1955, this is where close documentation of Edith Farnsworth's life ends. She's no longer embroiled in a conflict with the architect. It's not spilling over into the media. And this is really, I think, when she begins writing her unpublished memoirs, which look back on everything that happened up until the lawsuit, but nothing after. So from the time that Dr. Farnsworth fully inhabited this house in 1955 until her death, I had to kind of piece together what her life was and imagine what was between those pieces. What I could primarily draw from were her poems and photographs. And this is what was available to me in the Newberry Library archive. And this is where a careful read of these things really matter, because some historians have pulled the photograph on the left and the poem on the right and read them together as evidence of Farnsworth's depression. This is a very, sad or depressed looking image, her sadness at losing the trial, and the architect, that one could speculate that this is about sadness or depression. But I think these are misreadings created by and sort of building upon the misreading of events of the past. So as you can see in the slide, although this has often been misinterpreted as Edith Farnsworth, this woman is not Edith Farnsworth. Michelangelo Sabatino recently published a book identifying this woman as Jenny Gearing, who is a friend of Dr. Farnsworth. I don't know why she's posing like that. They were close friends. Maybe they were just having fun. And the poem on the right, while it's a poem about a bird crashing into the glass wall at the Farnsworth House, to speculate, make the leap that it was about losing the architect as a lover is kind of a twist that I don't know how one would go that far to say that. It's about, things that would happen around the Farnsworth House, and certainly there are a lot of things to be depressed about. It doesn't have to be about losing a love affair with an architect. So the speculation on Farnsworth's life and depression around the supposed dissolution of a love affair is usually pinned on these two artifacts in her archive. But I would need to see more of her poetry if I was going to do a deeper read of her life, if I was going to do something that was going to elucidate something about who she really was. And most of her poetry was actually held by her employer, Northwestern University Hospital. There were about 100 poems that a friend of hers had donated. And she published a handful of them. And so in the 1960s, she began publishing poetry in around the 1960s. And in this 1960 issue of Northwestern Tri-Quarterly, on the left, her poems are preceded by an essay that she wrote called The Poet and the Leopards. And in this essay, she writes, "Human beings have always needed to transcend their immediate experience, and we are just as human as ever." And she asks, but how is the transcending to be done? It reminded me of what Alice T. Friedman had written, that the process of being an historian requires one to project one's imagination into places that we cannot go, and that desire must motivate the searcher. That while we're rooted in material evidence, as historians, as writers, it's our imaginative potential that actually ties it all together. And in my recent conversations with Friedman, she says she's also turned to Saidiya Hartman's work as a great example of this. In particular, what Saidiya Hartman, the historian, writes as critical fabulation to address the gaps and omissions in archives and historical records. So using storytelling to imagine what was and what could be. So I looked at and read all of Farnsworth's poems, attempting to suspend the bias of thinking that she and the architect had an affair. The bias of always reading history through the lens of men is the bias of completely missing that Edith Farnsworth had dedicated some of her poems to a woman, MGP, or Polly Porter, who we see on the left side of the photograph here. It is right out in the open if we choose to look. And while I will admit I do not know the nature of Edith's relationship with MGP, I am curious that the poems she wrote for her show an intimacy that renders a facet of her life and her desire that has not been approached before. And I'll read a short excerpt from the book that will lend a little more life to this. So a collection of poems can contain the life that one is living or has lived, perhaps a life one has never lived but felt or imagined might be possible. In this collection is a poem dedicated to MGP, initials that recall Mary G. Polly Porter, one of the women reclining on the rocks in the Castine photograph. J'accuse. To MGP, you have beaten me with whipped cream and I am churned with butter. This has been in winter and in June. I mention it, enumerate to utter what I suffer from your flagellations. Is it too soon for me to say so or too late? She does not include a date on this poem. The initials MGP serve as both a form of erasure and a signal that I could try to read but never fully interpret. And yet, as Susan Stewart writes, poetry is a force against effacement, to make something where and when before there was nothing. J'accuse, a phrase that is a common expression against a powerful opponent. Here, j'accuse arrives with a wink. The accused has beaten Edith with whipped cream, churned her with butter. Either these delightful flagellations of being beaten or churned, so to speak, or the end of them, is the cause of suffering. And these events, real or imagined, are described as occurring in June and in winter, when Edith and Polly would conceivably have seen each other in Castine and in New York City. To read a poem that hints at the queer erotic among her collection is a relief, a signal to me of her humanity, her sense of humor, her sensuousness. To add the initials of a woman who is as good as married to somebody else, a bold move to leave open to interpretation. Perhaps, compiling this collection in the early 1970s from Italy, she felt the freedom to do so. And perhaps in this paragraph, I've done what so many historians have done before and simply projected a desire onto her. And yet, these are expressions of a life that I wish she'd left more evidence of and more fragments to align. Finding Edith Farnsworth's desire was always a bit difficult as I did this research because she was never fully explicit, but there were a few signs. She had the Farnsworth House rephotographed after she took ownership of it. On the left is the house imagined as a transparent modern project as published, and on the right is the photograph of it that Edith had a photographer named Gorman produce. And I believe that she actually art directed these photographs because in the series you can see that they're recreations of the photographs that Mies had Bill Blessing take. So as you can see these, it was a completely different kind of house in Farnsworth's eyes when you really compare the two side by side. Her photographs reveal the house as something much more wild, more opaque, more sheltered by the forest, the glass as less transparent. And in the photographs, the house almost seems to grow into its landscape as opposed to the transparent modern project that we see on the left, which was how it was published initially. And in these photographs, I saw how Farnsworth lived there, her furniture, but it left the question of how to write Dr. Farnsworth back into the building, how to actually write her presence into the Farnsworth house. Oops. The only available body I had to work with was my own, so I decided I needed to stand in as Edith. I wore a dress made the year that she commissioned the structure, and I wore a microphone and recorded the sounds that my body made in this space, trying to place Dr. Farnsworth's body back into the history if possible, and photographing myself in these various environments in the house. Of course, none of Mies's furniture would have existed in the house that Farnsworth actually occupied. She had her own furniture, not the pieces on display, many of which were designed for pavilions and houses built in Europe in the 1920s and in collaboration with Lily Reich. But to lie on the bed, to sit in the chair, to feel the movement of light in the house, and to hear the silence inside it were all critical experiences that allowed me to inhabit her world as a writer. And this is a process I learned not from other writers, but from artists like Mitchell Squire, who was a longtime mentor, teacher, and friend. And Mitchell's work was critical to my own practice as I worked out how to project myself into the history of this subject. I was particularly inspired by Mitchell Squire's series of photographs called Out From, in which he places what he calls the elder Black male body into the Midwestern landscape. So as he puts it, Mitchell writes, these are attempts taken during the COVID lockdown to unknow prevailing systems of thought that had limitedly defined my Black body's existence through the regime of labor, as well as anti-Black humanist thought. And I hear in Mitchell's statement this idea of attempting to unknow the prevailing systems of thought that limit his own body I hear in that echoes of what Edith Farnsworth would write in her memoir early on about not being limited by other people's assumptions, to move past them to a place where there is no limit to one's transcending. So Mitchell's work was really instrumental to me in thinking about how to project my own body as a sort of proxy for Edith into the Farnsworth House. And the photographs that I took led to an invitation by the National Trust for Historic Places to participate in curating an exhibition of the interior world of the Farnsworth House as it would have been furnished when she lived there right after the trial, when the trials concluded in 1955. So I worked with Rob Kleinschmidt and Scott Mahaffey, who's the director of the Farnsworth House, and we filled the house with furniture that approximated Farnsworth's furniture, so modern pieces that she had purchased at the women-owned furniture store Baldwin Kingery. So this experience transformed my understanding of how she may have lived in the Farnsworth House, the warmth of it as a space for writing, hosting, and living. And we also worked on recreating portions of her library for the exhibition. So there's furniture, but also books. And I even retyped all of her poems, or a handful of her poems, on typewriter paper to have around the house. I was curious about the fact that Edith and Mies spoke deeply about and disagreed on their own philosophical concerns. And this was a point I found really fascinating when researching them, that Mies van der Rohe was deeply informed by Catholic philosophers like St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and his buildings have been interpreted as a place for receiving a message from the beyond, in the words of Fritz Neumeyer. And that Edith herself was more of an atheist. She was a scientist. And though she deeply believed in the beauty of science, she also deeply believed in a sort of finiteness about life on Earth, which is something Mies van der Rohe would get really angry about, because he used to argue with her that whatever happens to him after death should be different than what happens to snowflakes when they melt, or what happens to salt when it dissolves. So this exhibition opened in June of 2020, just months after, as you recall, we went into lockdown in March. So the exhibition opened in June of 2020, and I drove to see it in October, just months after COVID shut everything down, but before we had a vaccine, a very strange window of time to be traveling. And I traveled from New Mexico to Illinois, driving the whole way, teaching online classes. And on the way to see the house, I visited with my parents. When I visited with my parents, I picked up a pony coat in Omaha when I went to see my parents. And the pony coat had belonged to a great aunt, a woman I'd never met, but whose presence was very large in our family history. She'd been married. There's a picture of her on the left. She'd been married, but then her husband had been murdered. And after that, she briefly lived alone in her own house in rural Nebraska. I began thinking about women in my own family, how infrequently they were single, but when they were, the way that their lives were very vivid expressions of their own desires. I thought about the fact that she would have been about Edith's age, and this pony coat was hers, the hide of a beloved pony that died and that she had turned into this beautiful coat. Unsure how to approach the Farnsworth house, I wore the pony coat in the frigid October cold, but I was not admitted into the interior of the structure wearing this. They were concerned that because it was an animal hide, there might be oils on it. It was really big. I might knock something over. So I couldn't go into the installation I created while I was wearing this coat. I stayed outside of the house. And I took a series of photographs meditating on the fact that Edith Farnsworth wrote extensively about horses in her memoir, about the time she came across a field of them that had been shot, and she was horrified, and the fact that architectural historians have long described her as horse-like or equine, a euphemism for being unattractive. In walking around the exterior of the house, I found myself moving not according to how architecture would demand I move my body, but moving the way that the coat demanded it. The coat was incredibly heavy, and it brought me to the ground. Beneath the structure, kneeling in the mud in the floodplain below the house, under the weight of a family heirloom that knitted my own family history to the site, I had a chance to consider the way that writing history is an embodied project. So I'd like to close this lecture by reading from near the end of my book. It's not the actual ending, so there will be no spoilers, but I want to read from near the ending of the book, which is the moment in which this photograph was taken. The house looks as if she never left, as if the river never rose to destroy all of her furniture, to soak the curtains and make them absolutely filthy. It waits as if she were never served that summon that began to fray her life at the edges, as if she still lives here. As I approach, I can see furniture that she chose for this house, the delicate lines of a Florence Knoll table and chaise lounges. I see the slipper chairs low to the ground, the stack of firewood that would make a perfect fire this afternoon if such a thing were allowed. For months, the house was suspended in time and it took us with it. A period during which I disinfected groceries, washing even apples and lemons with hot water and dish soap, prematurely rotting them. We all held our breath, the house and each one of us waiting, the kind of pause that happens between speaking words or turning a page in silence. But I am here now, and the body is still a body. I slip on the pony coat, and I stand next to the house. I want to feel the weight of being trapped outside of the glass house in an animal skin, to bring my great aunt, another woman who embraced solitude, to this place. It is heavy, and I don't know the name of it, don't know what she called it, this hide, but I feel it sinking me. I allow the coat to give me a different gravity, gestures that are not mine to let it double me over. I find myself in the large black space under the house. I kneel where her poodle grazed on the blood-clotted skulls of birds that had flown into the glass, letting my hide get covered in mud. I do not have to be precious with this body. It is borrowed, and I am wearing something that already knows death, that doesn't fear endings. It is easy to write about someone who is no longer alive. They cannot defend themselves, cannot argue, but it is also heartbreaking, a distance that cannot be collapsed. There is no tidy resolution to it. Her life has already ended, so where does the writing end? Even her memoirs end by refuting an ending. She writes, I must have dreaded the full appearance, the fait accompli, as something limiting, something final, leading to a conclusion. Tomorrow, her furniture will be carried out of the house, padded and crated. All of it will be shipped back to donors, companies, various spaces of storage. Tomorrow, I will drive west, return to New Mexico, to my life. It is the only life I will inhabit. The gravity of another person's life will no longer shelter, tether, or orient me for better or for worse. So I'll end there. I wanted to just say thank you for inviting me to speak about this history, for allowing me to read some excerpts of my forthcoming book, and to share that if you do intend to buy the book, that I hope you'll go to the press. It's the University of Illinois. And if you do go to the press, you get a 30% discount. So please take a picture of this discount code. And if you'd like to stay in touch, you can email me at this email address. And this is my Instagram account as well, which you can find by searching in Instagram. But thank you very much. It was really a pleasure to share this work with you. And appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Nora. That was fantastic and very moving and beautiful. So we really appreciate your time with us tonight. And now we have some time for questions. And we have the computer too, if anyone has questions online. I can start while folks are thinking. How did you come to connect with the Edith Farnsworth House to begin with?
Oh, that is a great question. I think, should I stop sharing? Here we go. That's a great question. So let me think. So I actually think what happened is I was finishing my undergraduate degree in architecture, and my professor at the time, Charlie Masterson, who was just this wonderful, curious, interesting person, left that magazine on my desk, the one that I showed at the beginning that said, Farnsworth House is up for grabs along with the juicy tale. And he left a Post-it note that said, what do you think of this? And I think he knew that I would be really curious about whether this narrative was true or not. And so from the first time I read that article, became really curious about this history. And as I dug into it, more and more curious. And then I think at some point, I reached out to the Farnsworth House to ask if I could do these performances there, and they said, sure. And ever since then, I think it's been a sort of ongoing dialogue with the director of the Farnsworth House. So I think now it's Scott Mahaffey, but I've worked with the two previous ones, Whitney French and Maurice, before that. So yeah, it's a great question. I think it began with that article and with somebody just leaving it on my desk saying, you know, I thought you would find this interesting. And I haven't really been able to sort of, or wasn't able to stop thinking about it until I could finish the book. It's a great question.
One in the center here.
That's fine. That's fine. I'm curious to know whether your research and your forthcoming book has changed the script of the tour guides through the house, whether the story has been dropped now, and how your work is maybe affecting the interpretation of the house for visitors.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the current director, Scott Mahaffey, is wonderful. And when he first reached out to me, I don't remember what connected us first, but one of his first questions to me was, can you help me rewrite this tour script? Because I'm realizing, you know, we don't have the sources to back this up. And I don't want to keep repeating a narrative that's not true. So I think it was in 2020, we completely revised the tour script for the Edith Farnsworth year when we had all of the furniture that belonged to her, or replications of what belonged to her in the house. So I think it changed in 2020. And I really have to give credit to Scott Mahaffey and the National Trust for, you know, paying attention, reading newer histories and reflecting on them so that they can challenge and change their own programming. But, you know, it really does rely on the person who's in charge of a tour site or of a property. So yeah, it's changed, which is great. So hopefully, although you can go, let me know, report back, somebody go get a tour and see if they bring it up. Hopefully not.
Okay, thank you very much for a very stimulating presentation. It was really wonderful. I know a lot more about plants than about architecture, but I was really struck by the pictures that you showed, the comparisons between Mies's view of the house and her view of the house. How much did she have to do with the design choices in the house? And to me, it looks like she just wanted to live in the woods, like she wanted a tree house or something.
Yeah.
And I just was wondering if you had any insight into her connection with nature and the world outside the house.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. When she describes finding the place where she wants to build her house, she writes about the linden trees and the mulberry trees and the other plants. And she just really describes exactly what you just said, like a robust kind of wild landscape. I mean, it had been a farm, a Tribune farm. I think at that point it had fallen fallow, and she loved that landscape. And I think that her connection to that place was what made her want to build a house there. It's a great question about what her influence was in the role of the design. I think it's hard for me to put a finger on it, right? Because she would go to Mies van der Rohe's office all the time. She spent so much time going there that her slides for her presentations, which had to be hand drawn back then, or her data for her presentations, like conferences, the office people, the architects working for Mies van der Rohe would actually draw those for her. So she spent so much time in that office that they would draw the slides for her presentations. She would see what they were drafting and drawing. But I think the question kind of becomes, if you're not an architect, can you understand a plan? Can you understand what's really going to be built? And although she would go to the construction site regularly, and although Mies would consult with her on materials, I don't know that she fully understood that she was going to be encased in a glass house. You know, there's this argument, I think it's Joseph Kettglass is an architectural historian who argues that when you draw glass, it's just a line. And so it looks like a boundary, it looks like a barrier. And it's hard to convey in a drawing really what glass is. So, you know, it's hard to say. I know that at one point, I think right before, I think it was maybe July 1950 or 1951, at one point there's a plan that showed curtains carving up the interior of the house. And that never happened. But at some point, I think she must have realized how fully transparent this is going to be, and said, I need some kind of partition, some kind of enclosure. And so there was a drawing made that showed curtain tracks carving up the interior of the house, which never happened, obviously, because those aren't there. But it's unclear to me how much she told Mies what she wanted. And of course, this is Mies van der Rohe, who's a famous architect. And so how much would he have listened? It's not really clear to me, but they did spend a lot of time talking. She loved conversation. She was a very, articulate, brilliant person. And so it's very possible that she would have wanted to sit down and talk about the house and then ended up talking about philosophy. I think she had that kind of mind. So it's a great question, and one I'm not sure we can really know.
I have a question from someone online. If she was here today and you could ask Edith Farnsworth one question, what would you ask her?
God, that's a great question. I think I'd ask her what her favorite day at the Farnsworth House entailed. I'd like to know. Like, on her favorite day at the house, what did she do? What was that day like for her? I don't know. I'm really curious how a day unfolded in that space. So I think I would probably ask her that. I don't think I would ask her anything very personal because I don't think she'd answer. So I would just ask her something I think she would answer.
I have one right in the center here.
Thanks. Could you talk a little bit about the flooding that's occurred and sort of what's happening? It seems like there was a flood during her lifetime there, but then more recently in the 90s and the 2000s, I'm assuming due to global warming, the house seems really threatened.
That is a fantastic question. If you go to the Farnsworth House website, they have flood mitigation plans. And I think and some of them are really techno-utopian and kind of curious. And I don't know which direction they're going to go. But yeah, the flooding is really a problem. And so the house was in a floodplain originally. Mies knew this. He knew that there was the potential that the house would flood. But I think that the formal concerns of making a house kind of outweighed the question of how long that house would last. Because, it's Mies van der Rohe. He's designing for the photograph. He's designing for the exhibition. He wants to get that done. And how committed he was to the house surviving 100 years, I'm not really sure. But the mitigation of the flood is something that the Farnsworth House is really trying to figure out. They have a few options. One that they've looked at and that I think Dirk Lohan, Mies's grandson, is really in favor of, is to put hydraulics on the structure so that if a flood is coming, they can press a button and the house just goes up 20 feet in the air. And they think they have a way to do it that won't harm the structure, but that raises the question about future floods. 20 feet, great, 15 feet, great, but is that going to be enough for the floods that we're anticipating under climate change, as you mentioned? It's a great question. And then another option I think they've explored is moving the house further up the hill, so away from the floodplain. But of course, that asks the question about the siting, which we know is such a critical part of this project, is its relationship to the river. So by moving it up closer to the road and the fields, what's lost? So I don't know that they have a clear direction that they've chosen, but you can go to their website. They have all this flood mitigation research they've done, reports they've written, and a few proposals that I know they're considering. But yeah, it's becoming an increasing concern. And I think the most recent devastating flood was, I think, June 2020. That was a pretty remarkable flood. So it's something that's definitely pressing to figure out. It's a great question.
We heard a lecture about Philip Johnson's glass house. Can you compare these two glass houses?
That's a great question. Well, so one thing I like to remind people is that Philip Johnson saw Mies van der Rohe working on this in his office. He saw the plans for the Farnsworth House. This is the lore. This is the story. Again, someone might write a book on this. I'm not sure if it's true, but the rumor I heard is that Johnson saw Mies working on this in his office and said, "Oh, that'll never work." And then, dashed off to New Canaan and designed his own glass house and got it done first. So so that to me is a really interesting origin story. And also, as an aside, it was Philip Johnson's accountant who convinced Mies van der Rohe to go after Edith, because the accountant looked at Mies van der Rohe's books and said, "This is why you're always broke. You're not charging people. Go after this woman. She's got money." So Philip Johnson's an interesting figure in the history of this house, because he shows up in these kind of, as Philip Johnson does, these like kind of problematic trickster sort of ways. But the two houses, it's a great question. I think the house in New Canaan has this relationship to the landscape that I think Edith Farnsworth was looking for. The landscape, as Philip Johnson famously said, becomes the kind of wallpaper around the house at New Canaan. Of course, the difference is that Edith Farnsworth is sleeping in her Farnsworth house. She's visible. People can see her in her bedroom in her nightgown, whereas Philip Johnson has the privilege of being invisible because his bedroom is separate from the living spaces that are visible in the glass house. So I think the house in New Canaan is absolutely exquisite. It's very beautiful. I think it's a bit heavy. It sits on the ground in a way that I think Mies van der Rohe probably, chuckled to himself about, because it doesn't float in the way that the Farnsworth house floats. I think the structure at the Farnsworth house is really remarkable. I think its relationship to the river is quite remarkable. But yeah, of course, that house is absolutely exquisite as well. Yeah, they're interesting figures to consider together.
One over here.
I'd like to ask if the glass has stood the test of time, or has it broken sometimes and had to be repaired? And we have, stronger glass today than they had back then. And I think it was one single piece of glass.
Yeah, that's a great question. I do know that, at least in recent memory, they have lost panes of glass just from high winds. So speaking about climate change, I think there were winds that fractured one of the glass panels. I know when the flooding happened, the really intense flooding, I think before Palumbo restored the house, it crashed through the glass and then took all the furniture and crashed out the back of the house. So I do know that the glass has been replaced a number of times, and I believe it's still single pane, because that's what was designed to be held in there. I believe it's still single pane, although now I'm saying this and I can't say for sure that I know that's the case. But absolutely, that glass is very vulnerable. It's very vulnerable to wind, climate change, accidents, anything that might run into it. Yeah, it's an excellent question.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. I'd like to know if did she love the house when she was living in it? Or did she find it a little bit problematic or annoying or anything else?
I think she was the kind of person who was annoyed by everything, which is something I love about her. I think she was very hard to please. I think she had very high standards about everything. So she would go out to the house. She kept her apartment in Chicago and her practice in Chicago, and she would go to the house Wednesdays and weekends. Those were her periods of time. And I think that actually, some of the photographs I shared, I think she looks really happy there. So there's a photograph I love where she's having coffee on the porch with a friend of hers who's actually the wife of one of the architects who worked for Mies, that she stayed close friends with, the Dunlaps. And she would bring her dog out there. At one point, her dog had puppies, so she had a bunch of little poodle puppies running around through the house. She would have people over to spend the night too. So she would host people in this space. They'd have mattresses on opposite ends of the house, but she would host people there. And Scott Mahaffey, the director of the house, told me this really funny story about someone recalling that it was hard to sleep during the night because Edith's poodles were running all over the place and running over them on the bed, that she just kind of had this very informal way of living in the house. And I do think she loved it. I think it was probably a place where she felt really at peace, and she, could cook or entertain friends. She had a lot of neighbors that she love to spend time with. And there are some really cute pictures of neighbor kids having, like, I think somebody in the area, their daughter was eating like a little peanut butter and jelly sandwich at Edith's desk. So I think she did love it. I think she, of course, like was annoyed by things. Like, I know she would write about how the glass would get dirty and she'd have to, squeegee it so it didn't look like a dirty windshield. And I think the heating was an issue, that it was quite expensive to keep it heated because, of course, as was mentioned earlier, this was single pane glass and there was no insulation. So, I think she was annoyed by the practical things that any one of us would become annoyed by. But, she did live in this way Wednesdays and weekends at the house for about 20 years. So I think she did enjoy it. I also think she was probably the kind of person who felt like she needed to get mileage out of an investment. So that might have been part of the reason she would continue to go out there. But she was really part of a community there. She had neighbors and friends that she would visit with and invite over. She insisted on teaching the neighbor children French. And so she would kind of like hold them captive in the house and make them learn French. So we had some funny stories that I learned about that. And I think people, I think they saw her as kind of a character and they, made space for her in their lives. So it's a great question. I think it was a little of both. It's a little bit of both, I think. Yeah.
Oh, got a few more here. Go here first.
Thank you. Did any part of the house open up in significant ways for warmer weather?
That's an excellent question. So there were 2 windows on I believe that was the east side of the house. Oh, they're still there. They're hopper windows. So they're kind of these half windows that go between the floor and about 3 feet up in the glass wall. So she could open these 2 hopper windows on the east side near her bed, and she could open the doors on the west side of the house. And so that was it. So she had these double doors and then the 2 windows on the other end of the house. And I think that probably was pretty problematic when it was hot. And I think one of the first things that Peter Palumbo did was to put in air conditioning, because you can imagine it's the Midwest and the humidity can be intense. And if you're trying to cool things off and you open the door and the window, you're by a river. So the mosquitoes are going to come in. So I think the summers were probably, if it was hot, pretty intolerable. Yeah, that's a great question.
Go here first.
Did Dr. Farnsworth ever pay Mies anything for his design?
She did. She paid him. And this is a great question, too. I don't think she's without fault. So to expect someone to design you a house and not pay them like an adequate fee is a little weird to me. So she paid him, I believe, at the beginning of the project, a few $1,000s. It was like maybe $2,000 at the very beginning. And then she settled the lawsuit, and I think she paid another $2,500 at that point. But it's an excellent question because he did create this remarkable structure. I mean, we could ask, why did it end up costing almost the equivalent of today's money, almost $1 million just in materials and labor? But yeah, he designed the structure and really, did not get a significant fee for it at all. Yeah, which is another reason they teach architects to make contracts. The lesson here.
Just a really quick question. How much land is the house on?
That's a great question. So it initially was, I believe, 11, and then she lost 2 acres because, and I didn't talk about this, but in the 60s, right before she sold the house, because she was really frustrated, I think, the county claimed eminent domain over 2 acres of the land closest to the roads that they could expand the bridge that was there. There was an 80-year-old bridge. It was really not safe with the amount of traffic increasing. And so she lost 2 acres of land near the bridge. So I believe right now it's sitting on 8 to 9 acres.
All right. Thank you for this lecture. It was really excellent and just interesting for somebody who doesn't know anything about the Edith Farnsworth House. So it's really remarkable. One thing that really interested me was that they were banging heads, the architect and the client, and it seemed to be a lot about freedom, for both of them. Mies's work is often known for the concrete or really structural, and this is something kind of new. And she was really, she seemed to be interested in that aspect. Being a medical researcher and a scientist, I was also interested if she looked at it as kind of an experiment, and if they both looked at it as an experiment, like the case study houses were, or that we're looking forward to seeing and learning about next time. So I don't know if you have any info on that aspect.
Yeah, that's such a great, I love how I just wrote that down because I love the way that you phrased that, and I'm probably going to use that in the future. Yeah, I love that description. I think it was about freedom. I think Mies van der was used to doing what he wanted to do, and I think Edith was used to doing what she wanted to do. And I certainly think, one of the things that Mies kept repeating during the trial, because during the trial, they keep saying to him, well, how did you not know what this house is going to cost on trial? And he kept saying, because I never know, because all of my buildings are experimental. He kept reiterating, even under oath, how could I possibly know? I'm on a journey, everything's an experiment. And I absolutely think Edith felt that way about her own research. She was really devoted to her research. And I think that probably was the thing that was really intriguing to her about his work, that it really was experimental. It was searching for something, some new form, new ways of being and living. And I'm sure that's what made them kindred spirits. I think that's an excellent way to put it. It really was, in the end, I think for both of them, about the experiment. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's probably why they found such, they were really friends for a long time. And it's too bad that after the trial, during the trial, they fell apart, because I do think they certainly had that in common. And I think there's a lot of mutual respect there for their respective disciplines. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Nora, for a wonderful presentation, for really bringing the kind of human perspective to this house, and really making it feel lived in for all of us here. And thank you all for a great Q&A session as well. There were some really great questions. So we look forward to seeing you next week for our final program in the series. And thank you again, Nora, for being with us tonight.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right, everyone, have a great night. Take care.
Thank you so much.